Hello, and welcome to Reactive Strikes in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The Reactive Strike is a feature for fighters at first level and may be gained through feats for most other martial classes. Despite differences in availability, they all function the same way. This ability allows characters to use their reaction to make a melee strike against an opponent who has dropped their guard. There are a few requirements to trigger this reaction. First, the enemy must be within your reach, meaning they must be close enough that you could strike them with your melee weapon or with an unarmed melee attack. And second, one of the following must occur. The enemy uses a manipulate action, the enemy makes a ranged attack, the enemy uses a move action, or the enemy moves out of its square during a move action that it is using. If both those criteria are met, being that the enemy is within range of your melee attack and performs one of the 4 triggering actions, then you may spend your reaction to make a melee strike against them. The strike is always made at your highest bonus without any multiple attack penalty, even if technically it may be your 4th attack that round. That's what Reactive Strike is, but let's take a closer look at each of these elements. First, the enemy must be within reach of your melee attack, and this would be whatever melee attack you have prepared at that moment, meaning it's either a weapon you're already holding or it's an unarmed attack. Any square that you can make a melee attack into is sometimes referred to as your threatened area, or that you are threatening those spaces. Now, for clarity, that's a 1st edition term that you will not find in the 2nd edition rulebooks officially, but I think those terms help illustrate this requirement. Anyway, the enemy must be standing in a threatened space for you to use Reactive Strike against them. Generally speaking, your threatened area will be the 8 squares immediately surrounding you. However, some weapons have the reach trait that allows them to attack enemies more than 1 square away. For example, halberds have the reach trait, which means they can attack enemies that are 10 feet away. And per the notation on page 426 of Player Core 1, this means they can attack enemies that are 2 squares away, including diagonally. So if you're wielding a warhammer, you threaten these spaces. If you're wielding a long spear, you threaten these spaces. If you're a hill giant, you threaten these spaces, and if you're a hill giant wielding a long spear, you threaten these spaces. As long as your enemy is occupying at least one of these spaces, they meet the first criteria for a reactive strike. Assuming at least part of the target is occupying a threatened space, the next question is, does the target meet one of the 4 triggering actions, the first of which is using a manipulate action? Any action that has the manipulate trait is considered to be a manipulate action. The manipulate trait notes any action that requires the user to physically interact with an object or to make gestures. Probably the most common place you'll find this is with interact actions. Interact has the manipulate trait, meaning anything that calls for an interact action is also a manipulate action. A few common examples include reloading weapons, drawing a weapon or a potion, fetching an item from storage, giving an item to or taking an item from another character, and opening a door. Another example would be activating items. For example, applying Black Adder Venom to a dagger requires 2 actions with the manipulate trait, which would trigger reactive strikes. Also, most spells have the manipulate trait too. We should also note that one action that may feel like a manipulate action because it involves moving an item is strike. The strike action used to make attacks with weapons does not have the manipulate trait, therefore melee attacks do not trigger reactive strikes. So the strike action itself does not trigger reactive strikes, but the second listed trigger is making a ranged attack, which is easy enough. If someone attempts to make a ranged attack with a longbow, while they're standing in one of your threatened spaces that could allow you to spend your reaction to make a reactive strike against them. And this applies to any ranged attack. Shooting a bow, throwing a dagger, or chucking an acid flask at someone all count as ranged attacks. And enemies making ranged attacks don't just trigger a reactive strike from their target, for example if they were firing point blank at an adjacent enemy, but they would trigger from everyone that they are within melee reach of, assuming those enemies have the ability to make reactive strikes. Ranged spell attacks also count for this, but there's a good chance that those spells are already covered by being manipulate actions as we've already discussed. The third possible trigger for reactive strikes is using a move action. If you use an action that has the move trait while standing in an enemy's threatened area, you might trigger an attack from them. A few examples of this would include falling prone, standing up from prone, or mounting a horse. Declaring any of these or other actions that have the move trait may trigger reactive strikes. And the fourth possible trigger is the enemy moves out of its square during a move action that it is using. And this may sound the same as the previous trigger of using a move action, but the difference is the previous trigger refers to declaring a move action while standing in a threatened space, and this fourth requirement covers situations where a creature might declare the move action while outside of the enemy's threatened space and then move through that threatened area. Typically, this will occur with stride actions, but may also happen with other forms of locomotion like swimming, flying, or climbing. Move actions trigger reactions not just when they are used, but again every time that creature attempts to leave a square. So if you use stride starting outside of a threatened space, you do not trigger any reactive strikes then. And if you move into a threatened space, you do not trigger anything either because the movement trigger occurs when leaving squares. But if you then leave that threatened space, you may trigger reactive strikes. But note that you may never trigger more than one reaction per creature with a single move action, no matter how many threatened spaces you exit, even if that creature somehow has more than one reaction to spend. Also be aware that the step action exists to allow creatures to move without triggering reactions. Step costs one action, and you can only move 5 feet instead of your full speed, but you do not trigger reactive strikes when doing so. And last, note that the name for this trigger is the enemy moves out of his square during a move action that it is using. Emphasis on that part. During a move action that it is using. In other words, if the target moves out of one of your threatened spaces but doesn't use one of their own actions to do so, then that movement does not trigger reactive strikes. Basically, if they're forced out of their space by someone else's action, like a shove attack, then you do not get to use reactive strikes on them. When reactive strike is triggered, the attacking character may spend their reaction that turn to make a melee strike against the provoking creature. As mentioned before, this attack is made using the attacking character's highest bonus and is not affected by or contribute to the multiple attack penalty. This strike is resolved as normal, except if the result is a critical hit and the reactive strike was triggered by a manipulate action. If that is the case, then the action is disrupted. When an action is disrupted, all resources and costs associated with that triggering action are still spent, but the effect of that action does not occur. For example, if you're a fighter and an enemy casts a spell with the manipulate trait while standing in one of your threatened spaces, you could spend your reaction that turn to make a reactive strike. If the result of that attack is a critical hit, then not only do you deal double damage as normal for a critical hit, but you also disrupt that spell from being cast. The enemy in this case still loses both actions they had invested in casting the spell, as well as the spell slot and any other resources that were invested in the casting as usual. The only difference is the spell effect does not occur. In some cases, it may be important to know exactly when the reactive strike occurs. For example, if a successful reactive strike results in killing an opponent, you may need to know which square the body occupies. If the reactive strike is triggered by an enemy moving out of a threatened space, the reactive strike occurs immediately, effectively before they leave that space. If it occurred after they leave the space, then they would likely be out of range of your attack. So if an adjacent enemy uses the stride action to move out of their space, you do not wait for that action to completely resolve and may attack them immediately. But if the reactive strike is triggered by using a move action without leaving their space, then the enemy gets to fully resolve that action before the reactive strike occurs. For example, if an enemy stands from prone, they completely stand up before resolving your reactive strike. This is important when determining if the enemy suffers the off-guard condition from being prone or not. That covers my introduction to reactive strikes, but do leave any questions you have in the comments below. And before we close out, I do want to say thanks to Scuba Steve from my Patreon, who was a big help in researching this topic. And I also want to thank everyone who supports me, whether that be by clicking the like button, leaving a comment, subscribing to the Patreon, or buying a super thanks. I really appreciate everything you do to support me. And with that, thanks for watching, take care, and happy gaming.